Hello.
Engage.
Engage. How's it going?
Engage.
How's it going,
I
Phil?
tell you to engage. And you on? I'm fine. Hello. How's it going? A little bit under the weather today, so apologies if there's going to be a lot of muting of the mic today. I just need to bring that out for a bit. But I have tea.
Good.
And Luke, how are you?
I'm good. I have coffee in my Janeway mug because that's
Nice.
how I roll on a Star
That's
Trek
how that's how we
episode.
go. Look at me. Could you appreciate the fact that I found this and I just tried to find some kind of a shirt that resembles a uniform
It's vaguely
Star Trek.
reminiscent of like Chris Pine's Star Trek, 2009 Star Trek when
Right?
he's like not wearing his gold shirt. And he's just wearing the
Yeah.
black one as he's running
Dun
around. But
dun 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 dun
yeah,
dun dun
yeah.
dun 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 dun. Yeah. There
So
we
how was
go.
your week? Do anything fun?
Yeah, I mean I think the viewers probably know if they know me that the audiobook that we've been working on with my co-producer Alex, AY Barker, has is 99.7% done. So it's so close. We're just working on those poems because, Rudyard Kipling, we're doing the Jungle Book. So Rudyard
Hmm.
Kipling wrote these poems that we kind of left as an afterthought before doing, this fully audio dramatized audiobook. And this is the last thing that we're working on. And we're nearing the end, nearing the end. So
Nearly there. Way to
that's
go.
that's been the week pretty much. Just
Good. It's
hacking
a,
that out. Just
it's a
hacking
good
and slashing.
it's a good productive week. Way to
It
go.
doesn't happen every day, but
No,
it's
no. But
awesome.
we're not going to dilly dally around because I'm excited
No,
for
absolutely not.
tonight's episode. Yes,
What is
today
tonight's
we are
episode?
talking all things Star Trek on the 35th anniversary of Star Trek The Next Generation, which I'm going to pretend that this was planned like that because, that seems like a wise thing to do. However, that's not the case. But it's great. And we have a guest with us today, Duncan
Yes,
Barrett.
absolutely.
He's a writer. I know him from working on the with Noiser podcasts. Big Star Trek fan. Has written some Star Trek books. But let's bring
Hey,
Duncan on and let him tell you a bit about himself. Hello, Duncan.
Hi, Luke. Hi, Phil.
hello.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank
We
you for
said it
having
at
me.
the same time, didn't we?
Pleasure
We
to
did.
beam aboard.
Yes.
Hey.
So
Yeah.
before we get into the Star Trek stuff, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Right. Well, I write history. Basically, the most of the books I write are not about Star Trek. They're about their history. I'm a kind of oral/social historian, which is how I got involved in writing history podcasts, which is how I met you. But the very first book that I wrote many years ago now is the one that you got in your hands, which was the book about Star Trek, which I have the distinction of having co-authored with my mum. I quite often write with
Oh
my parents,
wow.
which is one thing, but writing with your parents is an interesting one. But she is an English professor and kind of studies popular culture and that kind of thing. And when I was a teenager, I was getting really into Star Trek. Kind of first time round, she got kind of interested in it because I'd been forcing her to watch so much, and started writing this book about it. And I started off as a kind of research assistant, but ended up through a combination of me being quite keen and her being quite lazy, I think, writing several chunks of it. So I kind of got an author credit on that one. So I write these days. I write about Star Trek for the Guardian now and then, and I write features for the official Star Trek website now and then. And I have a podcast on the Trek FM podcast network called Primitive Culture, which looks at Star Trek history, literature, film, any inspiration, basically the stuff that inspired, particularly the writers. I've interviewed quite a lot of the writers of Star Trek for the podcast. Sometimes the directors, sometimes on the kind of art side. Basically, all the stuff that feeds into Trek over that, whatever it is, 50 plus years, and kind of why we get the Trek that we do at a particular moment. What it is, because this is not people working from a kind of blank slate. There's a lot of kind of culture out there that's feeding into it one way or another.
Yes, very true. That's fascinating. I didn't know that your book was co-written with your mom. I'm not gonna lie. I I sort of assumed it was your wife, and because I know your wife's a writer. And I thought,
she is Trek allergic, basically. Yeah, she won't. I've tried over the years.
Wow.
What keeps her at bay from Star Trek? What is it?
Well, I don't know, because she used to watch the original series as a kid. I know, because she told me her first crush was on William Shatner.
Right.
And she will just about at a pinch watch some of the original series movies. You might be persuaded to watch an original series episode, but anything, you're talking about Next Generation onwards, anything from that kind of era of Trek, which really is my kind of era of Trek. I got into Star Trek when Next Generation was airing. And then kind of followed it through from there, and then kind of obviously went back and watched the original show and the movies and so on. But yeah, anything from then on, she's just like, not having any of it.
Fair enough.
Tragic.
So Phil,
Me.
just so everyone knows,
Just so everybody knows.
Phil is not really a Star Trek. I'm not saying you're not a fan, but you don't know much about Star Trek. You've never invested in it.
No, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, I've never invested in it. I've seen it as it was part of popular culture growing up, right? Like Next Generation was on in the 90s. I was living in Austria at the time when I was going to primary school, and it would be on TV, and I would watch it, but I wouldn't get it because, I didn't even have 10 years. I wasn't even 10 years old yet. So, and I saw the action figures and all that, but like I've never sat down to actually engage in I can't help it. I can't. It just it's so easy to do. To actually absorb it until there was the aughts when living in Croatia when I was a little bit older, in my teens, the TOS was airing, like it was just on TV and stuff like that, and I kind of got an idea of what it was, but I was always a Star Wars guy myself. I'm more of a Star Wars guy, and so only like this time, like after the movies, did I finally start watching. In fact, like I think for this podcast, I've seen the most Star Trek I've ever had in my life.
Yeah.
Before coming on here this past week, and it's been fun. It's been very fun. But like, yeah, I don't know a lot about it. But it's funny because like when the movies came out, I felt like it was being very. I was like, this is a bit like Star Wars, but I don't know. Like I think Star Trek's
funny
a bit different.
So, some of us were thinking that as well at the time.
Yeah, and that's coming from someone who's never like actually watched like the show in depth to even kind of understand it. But I kind of felt like, isn't Star Trek supposed to be something else? Anyway, that's how I got this little thing from a cereal box in 2009, and I kept it for some odd reason. And here it is. It's a useful thing that I did because now I'm decked out.
Yes, you are. So Kay says, "Make it so, Phil. Get TNG binged." I recommend binging as much as you can.
That's exactly what I did. I went to TNG, and then I couldn't I know Luke told me to watch all these other shows, but I was like, I'll do it later. I'm watching another episode of TNG though.
Yeah,
so I just kept going on with that.
Though. I mean, that's the kind of the classic advice with Next Gen. Is
yes.
You skip the first 2 seasons.
Yes, and that's exactly what I did, and I did it.
Rough. Yeah,
I did it haphazardly too. I did it like without even knowing, but I was like, I'm still gonna watch season 3 some more.
Yeah. Season 1 and 2. It feels like both TNG and Deep Space Nine struggle with their first couple of seasons a little bit. I think there's probably more in season 1 of Deep Space Nine that is good versus what's in Next Generation. That's good, maybe. At least in my opinion, I'm a big Deep Space Nine fan. Right. So Duncan, you kind of mentioned earlier when you were talking about your wife and her not being into it, about you getting into Star Trek. So let's kind of go back to that just a little bit first. Do you remember what was it that got you hooked on Star Trek?
I think because I've thought about this. I've tried to kind of trace what was my first sort of exposure to Star Trek, because obviously it has become a significant part of my life one way or another. I think I remember being at primary school and watching, I'm pretty sure, The Devil in the Dark at a friend's house, but I don't think I knew what it was, but I was kind of intrigued. But I really got into it. My cousins in Ireland had Sky, and I think this was at the time, I don't know, I'm sure Next Gen had been on BBC at that stage, but maybe it was in a break and I hadn't happened to catch it or whatever. And they were getting brand new Next Gen, certainly by UK standards, brand new. And so I was on holiday visiting them in Dublin one time, and I watched a load of the videotapes that they taped off the TV, and so I got kind of quite into it then. And I think I remember seeing something with Romulans that made an impact, and I think the episode that really struck me, or at least that I have this kind of strong memory of, is Ship in the Bottle, which is the one with the second one with Moriarty and the whole kind of Sherlock Holmes thing. And they have this mind-blowing thing where it's all about, so it takes place, I don't know how many of your listeners are not Trekkies, and I've gone way off the deep end already, but
this is what this episode is for. Right. They can deal with it.
That takes place on the holodecks. The holodeck is like a kind of virtual reality kind of fantasy scenario, so sophisticated that you can't tell the difference between it and reality. And what happens in this story is they have these fictitious characters of, Professor Moriarty from Sherlock Holmes, and he wants to be brought from the holodeck onto the actual ship, and everyone's like, no, that's not possible, because you don't really exist, you're just a computer program, and he thinks it's possible, and they come up with some technology that supposedly does it, and he appears on the ship, and everyone is kind of flabbergasted. And then at about sort of 2/3 of the way through the episode, they realize that what's actually happened is they never left the holodeck, and the whole thing is an illusion, and Moriarty, being the arch genius, has kind of tricked them and made them think that they're on their ship, whereas in fact he's still in the holodeck. And I think just that absolutely blew my mind as like a 10-year-old kid or something. I was like, oh my god, what is going on with this show? So I think that was one of the ones that really made an impact. And then when my kind of whole binging and my kind of real fandom started was probably about, I think within a year of that, I had a period off school. I had glandular fever, and so I was laid up in bed for, I think, like 3 months, something like that, quite a sizable amount of time. And so I piqued my interest in Star Trek, and I discovered that the local Blockbuster Video, so this dates me a little bit, had they used to have the VHS tapes, and they would have, for some reason, if you bought them, you got 2 episodes. If you went to Blockbuster, you get 4 episodes per tape. So you get quite a lot each time. And I literally had my mum, this is how she got into Star Trek originally. Every day she would go to Blockbuster, take back the tape I'd watched the day before, get me the next one. And so I kind of worked my way through Next Gen.
That's great.
By tape, racking up astronomical Blockbuster Video fees, I'm sure, but to the point that then by the time like DS9 was debuting and Voyager was debuting, I was kind of caught up, and I was pretty hardcore fan by that point.
Totes.
No, that's pretty cool. For me, it's interesting because I don't have a specific point where I'm like, there was a moment, here's the moment where I watched an episode or saw the film, and that's what got me hooked. I just remember from a young age always loving Star Trek and always watching it. I mean, literally from probably the age of around 7 or 8 is when I started to really get into it. But what it was that tipped me over the edge, I'm not fully sure what that was, but I just remember renting the episodes of TOS from the library. All
DVD
the time.
or VHS?
What did I say? Yes.
DVD or VHS?
Oh, sorry, VHS.
Okay,
yeah, okay. VHS. I mean, this is we're dating me now, so this was 1996-ish, something like that. TNG is all over the television, of course, when I'm a kid, so it's kind of in my face. But yeah, so I really got into it by watching the TOS episodes from renting from the library, and then renting the films, and then moving more into Next Gen and jumping on Deep Space Nine. I think it must have been season 5 or 6. I had a good 2.5-3 years of watching Deep Space Nine live, and then capping that off with Voyager. And yeah, Deep Space Nine was that resonated with me the most. I don't know why, but Deep Space Nine was something that I loved. But Kay in the chat says his first episode was the death of Tasha Yar via the Death Puddle. What do we think of that episode? Well, by we, Duncan, because I don't know if you've seen that.
I have no idea who these people are.
Oh well. Well, yeah. I mean, if you do go back to the beginning, don't get too attached to Tasha Yar, because she doesn't stick around that long. I mean, what do we think of it? It's a weird episode. It's quite quite an odd one. I do think it was quite a ballsy move to kill off a main character like that. I mean, it happened because the actress was not enjoying herself,
Yes,
and wanted out. But the fact is, they could have written her out in any number of ways, and the way that they not only kill her, they kill her in a pretty kind of brutal, nasty way. I mean, there are other characters in Star Trek who die more sort of heroic, more poetic deaths. Tasha Yar just kind of gets, wiped out, and it's not even at the end of the episode. It's not like a noble sacrifice or anything like that. She's just, the wrong time. She's the red shirt, basically. They kind of, so in some ways you can see it as kind of inverting that kind of red shirt trope that, the expectation is that the characters that you know and love who are in the credits, nothing bad can ever happen to them, but any random in a red or a gold, in the case of Next Gen shirt, who beams down is going to be toast. They kind of played on that in a way by doing it to one of the regulars. But I mean, it is an early Next Gen episode. It is a bit weird and wonky. I quite like the way they bring Armus, the Death Puddle, this person says, back in Lower Decks, which I'm sure we can come to at some point.
Yes.
So yeah, he's still out there, I guess.
I like that. No, I also, you probably know this as well, but there's this, in the episode before the one she dies, there's a scene where she waves at the camera, and it's in the show. So I think Picard or someone is leaving the shuttle bay, I think it is, and as the doors begin to shut, she waves at the camera, and she knows that the next episode, she's already filmed her last episode. She's already filmed her death scene. And that was her way of sort of saying goodbye to people. And then on the editing, in the editing bay, that scene still got in of her waving goodbye, and it's forever immortalized in the show, which is quite interesting. I do feel bad for Tasha Yar, but she wasn't a character that I connected with very much. I don't know why, because I really love like Kira in Deep Space Nine, and they're kind of similar, where they're just really tough. They don't take crap from anyone, individuals. But maybe it's because Next Gen was so uneven on season 1 and struggling to find its place, that had she stayed, she could have been better developed, because by the time we see her again in Yesterday's Enterprise, that version of Tasha Yar, I'm like, I like this Tasha Yar. This Tasha Yar is not annoying. Like, this is cool. But
also, you talk about Kira. I mean, I suppose there is that kind of analog with Kira. Also, I would say in Strange New Worlds, they basically got Tasha Yar Mark II. The character of Lan is very much a Tasha Yar type, but it just works, for any number of reasons. They seem to have nailed it, like how to do that character in a way that I think maybe they weren't quite sure. There was sort of a lot on her shoulders somehow. You had, there was this, if you look at like some of the publicity shots at the time, they were trying to lean on this idea. They've got these 3 female characters, sort of almost half the bridge crew compared to the original series, which basically had 1 plus the nurse, showed up from time to time. But at the same time, one of them's a doctor, one of them's a therapist. So Tasha Yar carries a lot of this like sort of kind of 80s feminism that was stuff in somewhere like this kind of, she's going to be this kind of badass female character. And I think she was inspired by the woman in Aliens, Vasquez, is that her name, in Aliens? I think that was a kind of deliberate, like a reference point. And at the same time, I'm not sure they quite knew how to do that, or how to make that mesh with Star Trek, or how to make that mesh with what they were doing with Next Gen. And also, just as you say, those early seasons of Next Gen are pretty hit and miss, because a lot of it, they didn't know what this show was supposed to be. Is it meant to be the original series Mark II? And there are episodes that certainly feel like that. Is it meant to be something different? And there are episodes where they're kind of trying to do something different. And it does take a few years for them to kind of, I think, work out an identity for what that show is. And every Star Trek show, to some extent, since the original series, really has done that and has had these kind of course corrections.
Yes.
And usually it does take a few years to kind of iron out. You know, I mean, Discovery has been like practically a different show every season. I think it's only maybe from season 3 onwards you can say it's kind of, you know, season 3 and 4 feel like they're kind of just about the same. You're watching the same TV show, but seasons 1, 2, and 3 were just like wildly. And with Picard so far, you know, wildly different approaches to what a Star Trek show might be. And I think that's kind of always been the case. And some often there's improvement. I mean, I think, you know, all those 90s shows, they got better in a lot of ways. Yes. On the other hand, I always think it's good to go back to those early episodes once you've bought into it, once you are a fan, because there's something quite pure about them. If you think about Voyager, for example, I love the first season of Voyager, and there are a lot of misses in there.
Yes.
But when it works, there's something really pure about this concept they've come up with that gets lost, I think, in later seasons. So in later seasons are more confident, they're more kind of, you know, they bring in 7 and 9, very popular character, very, very interesting, successful character. But the show loses, I think, a bit of what it was about, if you know what I mean. It loses its kind of raison d'etre. And arguably DS9, as much, I mean, DS9 is my favorite Trek show, that DS9 moves into this kind of big, massive, serialized war arc. It's kind of a bit like what Babylon 5 was doing around the same time. Really amazing, groundbreaking. I mean, literally, you know, seminal TV. You wouldn't have the kind of golden age of TV if you hadn't had those sci-fi shows doing it first. No. On the other hand, those slightly wonky early seasons of DS9, there's a kind of purity to it. They kind of lean into this is this random backwater place where weird stuff goes on, and you know, there's a kind of concept there that slightly gets shoved out the way as we bring in Worf and we kind of ramp up the action and we kind of go for this war storyline, you know, which was absolutely to the benefit of the show, but at the same time it was different. It was a course correction, and I think Trek has always done these course corrections, and you know, you gain a lot, but sometimes you lose something at the same time.
Yes, yeah, I agree. I suppose I guess we'll probably come to this a little bit later. Is my thought would be I don't know if, while yes, the early seasons of you know, TNG, DS9, and Voyager are shaky at times. I agree that they do have these elements of purity, and they progressively get better. I don't see that replicated fully in what's going on with some of the shows at the moment. But we'll save that for a little bit later, and I'll explain what I mean a little bit later. I kind of want to talk a little bit first about kind of the early stuff, a little bit about TOS, right? What I want to know is kind of what would you say are maybe the best episodes of the original series, and what is it about those episodes that kind of stand out to you?
Well, funnily enough, since, as I said, I think it was the first episode of Star Trek I ever saw, I would say Devil in the Dark would be probably my top TOS episode. I think it's got a lot of classic Trek stuff. It's got there's a good kind of adventure story there. There's a very, you know, slightly heavy-handed moral lesson, but it's quite cleverly done because there's this kind of reversal that, you know, first time you see it, you maybe don't see coming, and there's a kind of, there's something a bit kind of weighty there. Great Kirk and Spock stuff. I mean, talking about Sherlock Holmes earlier, that is one of these episodes where Spock is basically Sherlock Holmes. He's like streets ahead of anyone else. He's the kind of genius. The group, Kirk is kind of following along in this sort of Dr. Watson role, almost like, you know, trying to work out what's going on. I think that's an absolute classic. I love the Corbomite maneuver. Actually, very early episode. I think the first episode filmed after the 2 pilots. So there was the original discarded pilot, and then there was the pilot that ended up being aired, but they all aired out of sequence. But Corbomite maneuver, which I think is like episode 6 or 7 by air date, is actually the first one that they shot. And that, again, I think there's a kind of purity to that in some ways. You posted on Twitter this question, you know, is Star Trek a parody of itself these days? And I slightly facetiously responded, well, it's been a parody of itself since like at least 1967. I think arguably even earlier. By which all I meant really was that Star Trek has changed the parameters for what Star Trek can be
Yes.
many times over the years. I mean, in 1964, Gene Roddenberry wrote this pitch document called Star Trek is ... And I think that question, what is Star Trek,
Yeah.
and what can it be, has expanded and expanded and expanded in various ways. And the original series, if you look at something like the Corbomite maneuver, up until the slightly weird ending, but like for the first say 95% of that episode, it's very tense. It's very it's quite serious. It feels like sort of proper science fiction, if you know what I mean. It's not kind of wacky, jokey science fiction, which Star Trek can also do, and certainly the original series kind of leaned into, probably increasingly. But so the reason I was saying, is it a parody of itself? I would say, arguably, by the time you get something like A Piece of the Action, which is another fantastic episode, but a kind of comedy episode, Star Trek has decided it can use these characters and use this world to tell stories that are not taking themselves all that seriously. A little bit like, say, the X-Files did, 30 years later. There's a show that can be really gritty, really dark, really serious, really powerful drama, and yet every so often they chuck in an episode that's basically a spoof of itself. They're spoofing
that stuff.
Characters, they're spoofing their own kind of cliches, and Star Trek was way ahead of it in a way, in kind of doing all that stuff and sort of saying, look, this is a very big sandbox to play in. And I think maybe that's one reason I'm more forgiving in some ways of the Trek that is not my favorite Trek, if you know what I mean. And I would say, the new Trek that is out now, I think is quite hit and miss. I would prefer it if they'd gone in slightly different directions to the ones they have gone in. On the other hand, there have been elements of it that I've loved, but I sort of feel, particularly as kind of one of these like grouchy old guys who, in the 90s, I remember the guys of our age then who were like saying, what do you mean they're doing Star Trek without Kirk and Spock? This is outrageous. I'm sort of conscious of not being one of those guys and trying to give it space to breathe, see what happens. Maybe it will take a few years, maybe it'll take a few more years in some cases. Maybe it'll get there. Maybe it's a kind of gateway drug. I mean, like the J.J. Abrams films, I made this remark about Star Wars. I hated that first film the first time I saw it. I enjoy it more now. And the third one I actually genuinely really like. Second one, pants. But I kind of had to reconcile myself to the fact that although it's not really Star Trek for me, even that 2009 film, it brought a lot of people in Star Trek, and they then went back. You got your badge from a cereal box or whatever, and a lot of people, that was a kind of gate. There are a lot of things about that film I don't like in the least, but I kind of have made my peace with it.
I know. I see what you mean, and I do agree with what you're saying, and I think when the question of has Star Trek become a self-parody is really not necessarily looking at it, episode by episode sort of situation, but looking at sort of, the TOS into Next Generation DS9 and really comparing that chunk of Trek history to what we have now. And obviously the problem with that kind of attempt is that, there were the comparisons back in the day where people were not happy with, TNG not having Kirk and Spock and all that kind of stuff. I would like to think that we are so far beyond that kind of argument now that we don't need to worry necessarily about that. But I think when I say, has this become a self-parody, it is more about, has Star Trek in some ways kind of Austin powered itself a little bit, and it's sort of imitating what came before without maybe pushing into new territory. And I think what bothered me really about, we can talk about JJ films in a bit as well, but when it came to like Discovery coming out, I think what disappointed me the most initially had nothing to do with there being a new Star Trek. I was excited for new Star Trek, but I was disappointed that we were doing 10 years before Kirk and Spock. Because after Voyager, after Nemesis, I am hungry to see what happens afterwards. And arguably we have started to see some of that with Picard, and I guess a little bit with Discovery. Am I I'm not necessarily pleased with the direction they've taken the future either with that.
So I have a question.
Go
and
on.
It's a really stupid question, but
There are no
so
stupid questions except the dumb ones.
I know. So does Discovery take place after or before?
Discovery takes
Before
place.
what? I know.
Discovery
Oh,
takes
no.
place 10 years before Kirk and Spock. So 10 years before TOS.
See, I thought so. Yeah. Okay.
And then Strange New Worlds takes place kind of even
Yeah, right.
even more capacity.
8 years.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think absolutely there is, and this goes beyond Star Trek. Someone in the chat says, I think a lot of franchises have Austin empowered themselves. Yeah, I mean, the whole culture, it's like a weird time loop. I mean, it's weird for us, you know, Ghostbusters, there's a new Indiana Jones, you like Star Wars, everything from our childhood is constantly coming back. I think it must be really weird for kids today, because like pretty much everything that come out, they must be like, okay, so what's this weird reference, what's this 40-year-old thing I have to go and watch now to understand this film? But I don't know, whatever. That's a kind of bigger cultural process. I think with Star Trek there's always been this tension between you know, they used to talk about it as, you know, with Next Gen they managed to catch lightning in a bottle twice, because that was there was something magical about the original series. No one ever thought it could be replicated. I mean, Patrick Stewart famously didn't unpack his bags in his hotel room because he was like, this show is just not, you know, this is not going to work. They thought it was a kind of cynical ploy to just get, if they could get a couple of seasons of Next Gen, then that would be enough episodes of Star Trek overall for them to syndicate it and sell it as a package, because they'd only had these 3 seasons of the original series. They hadn't had enough for like the economics of, you know, TV syndication back then. Of course, it became this massive hit, and I agree, you know, DS9, Voyager, I think, I mean, people have issues with them in different ways. I think they're both great, especially DS9 and Next Gen I think are fantastic shows. Voyager I think is a slightly mixed bag, but you know, there's lots to love there, let's say. But then after that, of course, Star Trek kind of got obsessed with this nostalgia thing. So you have Enterprise, which is the prequel, which is going back to before Kirk and Spock, and that was a big decision for them to not go any further in the future, not imagine any further forward. Then you had the JJ films, again going back to Kirk and Spock, but these are young Kirk and Spock, which was something they toyed with. You know, they'd always had this idea of with the movies, rebooting the movies and having the younger Kirk and Spock, and then they kind of found a new way to do it. Then you get with Discovery, we're kind of back in that time frame again. And I think for those of us who grew up in the 90s with Trek, who grew up with the kind of 24th century Trek, it was a bit alienating that we're being told that everyone is only interested in the 23rd century or even earlier. You know, that's the kind of reference point for Star Trek. Whereas we got used to this incredibly rich tapestry with these 3 shows, where they were really doing a lot of this kind of, in a slightly primitive way, they were doing a lot of this kind of stuff that you get now with the MCU or with storytelling.
Absolutely.
Storytelling, where there were, and you know, it wasn't always brilliantly handled, but there were characters who kind of crossed from one show into another. There were story threads that sort of tied in. They were kind of making an effort to make it feel like this was one.
Totally.
There was a bigger story in which these stories were taking place, if you know what I mean. And I think that the tendency to pull back and to kind of tug on those strings of nostalgia is slightly, I think it's a tricky one, because it kind of, it's a bit like, what are you doing it for? Is this just about fan service? Is it just about a certain idea of what that big question Star Trek is? What is it saying about Star Trek? Is it's kind of going back to this idea, actually Star Trek kind of is Kirk and Spock. And even with Strange New Worlds, so we got the Pike show, I loved the first season of Strange New Worlds, but you know, we've got most of the cast of TOS in that show now. We've got Kirk already. It's kind of like, I mean, when does the prequel become just retreading the same ground? Do you know what I mean? I kind of,
absolutely,
it's a dangerous area for Trek for me. But
I wholeheartedly agree, and I think what agitates me a little bit about Strange New Worlds is that, and it's like, well, guys, like, let's just be real. This is a reboot. In my opinion, it feels like a reboot because of these decisions of putting Uhura and Chapel and Sam Kirk, and then actual Kirk in the season 2. It, with having Spock be this weird brother to Burnham, all of this stuff. I'm like, well, it really doesn't at all connect with canon. And I know that canon can be tricky because, you know, even between TOS and Next Gen, all that kind of stuff, there are things that don't fit. But on a whole, it works quite well, all things considered. And so those things I think do really bug me. But back to your other point about like us growing up with the 24th century in the 90s. I mean, as a kid, I loved watching The Legacy. I loved going back to the original show, moving into the films, moving into Next Gen, moving into Deep Space Nine, and just watching this 100 or so odd year plus timeline play out. And I think what Next Generation did so well was it didn't milk the member berries. It was season. I know that McCoy is in episode 1, but he is so aged up and looks nothing like McCoy that the casual viewer who doesn't know Star Trek, they're not going to know who he is. The people who are into Trek are going to understand this is a nice little wink. And it's not shoved in your face, because he doesn't even say his name, I don't think. Or maybe they say Admiral McCoy or something. I can't remember. But he's not like, back in my day when I was on the Enterprise with James T. Kirk and Scotty.
They didn't have the close-up where he comes in and then you can hear it.
Right, which they would do right now. That would absolutely be the music manipulating you kind of thing.
Close, the camera coming in like this.
Yeah. And I appreciate Star Trek Next Gen for doing that. Deep Space Nine, I think, did the same thing. They had the Klingon from, oh gosh, help me remember his name, Duncan.
All the Klingons.
They had all the Klingons, but the one core, right?
Yeah, they brought back all the original series Klingons pretty much.
And the thing is, they did it in such a way that was, I want to say, elegant, because it wasn't. There's a couple of throwaway lines. Every once in a while, you might hear the name Kirk, but it is a passing reference, and I love that because they're not focusing on that or making the episode about that, but they are acknowledging the kind of the, like you were saying, the bigger, wider story of this whole universe. And again, once you get to Deep Space Nine and you get to Trials and Tribulations, I mean, not only is that one of the best anniversary episodes of Star Trek in Star Trek history, but it all felt so earned to see the Deep Space Nine crew through movie magic interacting with Kirk and Spock and being on the original Enterprise and all that kind of stuff. And I think likewise with TNG, I think it was season 5 before Spock turned up and season 6 before Scotty. And arguably those are some of the best episodes of Next Generation, not because they're bringing the old people back, but because it was an earned moment, I think. And this is where I struggle, as I'm not sure that some of the new stuff earns what it's trying to do, I think. Some reviewers that I would like to listen to, they jokingly said in their very first review of Discovery, so Discovery, the 2-parter had just come out, and they did a review, and they jokingly said, well, if the numbers start dipping, they always got Spock in their pocket. So it was hilarious by the end of the season that, you see the Enterprise come swooping in, and it's like, oh, like, if you're going to do 23rd century pre-Kirk, just have them out of it. Like, I don't think that Discovery earned the Enterprise by the end of season 1. And, I think like what, Frank was saying in the chat, that a lot of franchises have also empowered themselves. It's so much, it's all about, there's too much reliance on callback. And I think that's what, I do think that's what frustrates me.
It's no Better Call Saul, let's say. I mean, that was a show that took the whole kind of prequel thing, and there were a lot of worries, I think, of, what's this show going to be? How are they going to manage to do anything with it? How's it possibly going to live up to Breaking Bad? In fact, they ended up you know, arguably making a show that was even better than Breaking Bad. But their legacy characters, because there were smatterings of like smaller legacy characters from the beginning, and they had a few, you know, throughout. But the big ones they saved till like the back half of the final season, and by then they really had earned it, and they did remarkably, I think, manage to tie that show into the kind of Breaking Bad storyline quite well by the end. But it wasn't like the whole thing was leading up to it. You could say arguably Enterprise kind of in a similar situation, but it played out slightly differently. You know, first couple of seasons of Enterprise, they were trying not to be a prequel to the original series. Third season of Enterprise, they kind of went nuts and did this whole 9/11 thing. Fourth season of Enterprise, they were like, yeah, this is a prequel to the original series, which is kind of the show that I think everyone expected them to make from season one. And they kind of weirdly trying not to make. And then they finally were like, yeah, all right, fine. Okay, that is the show that we're making. And actually it worked quite well in a way.
Yeah.
I think there's this, I don't know, I agree with you. I was, you know, the thing is, a lot of these things, they are fan service, and a lot of fans love them. I mean, when the Enterprise turned up at the end of season 1 of Discovery, people were ecstatic, you know, and they always are at these things. You know, people get really excited. They love it. They feel like all these, you know, the right nerves are being touched, the right kind of buttons are being pressed. But yeah, I, like you, always have this slight cynical edge of like, you know, really, you want to go there right now?
Yeah.
And I certainly felt that. I mean, I actually, Strange New Worlds, I loved, as I say, but I didn't like that final episode of the season, which most people thought was like the best thing they'd seen for years. I felt that leaned too much into the kind of TOS thing. I didn't really want to see Kirk. I didn't particularly like the new Kirk.
No.
And I didn't want to see a kind of rehash of an original series episode that was, you know, a classic as it was. I don't know. It that didn't work for me. That kind of spoiled actually all the stuff that I did like about that show, which was where they were doing things that were a little bit different. I mean, one thing I'd say, I get what you're saying about it being a reboot. I mean, obviously it technically isn't a reboot, but the things that work about it are the rebooting of characters. You know, someone like Chapel. Chapel is a crap character in the original series. Chapel in Strange New Worlds is a fantastic character. You know, they really managed to breathe life into these kind of legacy characters, but by, to some extent, throwing out who they were. I mean, you know, I quite like the original Captain Pike in The Cage. I love Anson Mount. I think he's very charismatic. He's a great captain. I'm not sure that he has much in common with Jeffrey Hunter's Captain Pike, but, you know, he's a much more Kirk-like Pike, really, to be honest. But I don't know. I mean, those things I sort of think they work, and you can kind of make excuses for them, and, you know, and a little bit of toying around with canon we can put up with, as long as, you know, you can bend it, as long as you don't break it completely.
Yes, and I think that's so I agree, because I don't want to completely like dog on the other stuff, because there is some stuff in New Trek that I actually like, and again we'll chat a little bit later about that. But like, so yeah, Anson Mount I do think is a really good Pike. I can buy him as Pike, even though he's not like, you know, Menagerie Part 1 and 2 Pike. You know, I'm fine with that. His hair is a little bit ridiculous, as amazing as it is.
Some rad hair though.
He must spend at least 5 hours getting that hair perfect before he comes on for his shift. And I do appreciate trying to give life to certain characters who maybe in TOS were not that interesting. Someone like Chapel, yes, she was pretty peripheral. She didn't have a lot to do. Didn't, you know, it's a shame that she went from being number one in the Mirage, in the original pilot, to just kind of being a nurse on the side. But she comes back as a rock star in Next Generation as Troy's mother, and I absolutely love Lwaxana Troi. But yeah, so, you know, I appreciate them trying to do stuff with those characters. The problem is I'm like, I do begin to wonder, have they bent it too far with certain people? Is it to a point where I actually don't recognize these characters as who they're meant to be? And it was tricky for the JJ films, because I do think Chris Pine did a pretty decent job imitating Kirk as we know him via William Shatner. And I think in terms of legacy, it is, if you are going to recast and rebring these legacy characters back to life by new actors, I think you do have to sort of, this isn't like Sherlock Holmes, right, where you can have a new actor being Holmes but in a slightly different way. I think the way these actors, the way Leonard Nimoy and William Shatner and DeForest Kelley brought these characters to life, are really the main examples of how you should be doing them, just to some degree. Nurse Chapel, she's a bit reserved, and this one she's sort of action hero-y, and it's like, is there a middle ground there between her, running around being quippy and also maybe being a little bit on the reserved stoic side, that you could find a better middle ground for certain characters? And I think particularly Spock and Uhura drive me nuts in Strange New Worlds.
Oh yeah,
because I mean we watched, what did we watch? All Who Wander, or all, what was the episode?
All Good Things?
Nope. Hang on, I will tell you the episode that we watched that you recommended. All Who Wander. That was it.
Aliens one, which I loved, but partly because I love aliens. But
yes. I think, like, for example, that was an episode that kind of highlighted some things that generally annoy me about Strange New Worlds, and that was Uhura is questioning where she wants to go in life, where is she going to go.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is we all know where she's going to go. So why does the audience care about her, care about that particular interpersonal dilemma? It's not like Best of Both Worlds, where Picard has been snatched by the Borg, Riker's finally the captain of the ship that he wants to be the captain of, and we don't know if Picard is coming back,
Okay.
And I think it's like, well, when you do stuff like that, that's fine, because we don't know what's happening next. But when it's a legacy character and we know where they're going, is it taking the easy road by doing something like, oh, Uhura doesn't know where she's going to go in life, we'll have this bunch of speculation about where she wants to end up, and at the end of the episode she looks lovingly at the comm station on the Enterprise, and it's like, well, yeah, we know you're going to end up there, so you're not exciting me. This isn't, I'm not pumped about where you're going because I know where you're going. And I think to some extent Rings of Power has that problem.
I mean, this is the kind of trap that a prequel can so easily fall into, isn't it? And again, I'd say, Better Call Saul dodged that by keeping us sort of guessing right to the end but by actually saving that kind of moment of the shift from the one show into the other until right, pretty much at the very end, almost kind of keeping us guessing as to what the answer to those things, those kind of questions are. But I think you're right. I mean, I don't know, it's kind of tricky because Uhura again is kind of a pretty slim character. I mean, most of the original series characters, other than Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, are not a lot there. No. I mean, Nichelle Nichols obviously was amazing, iconic, incredible performance, magnetic screen presence. So she kind of brought a lot to not very much, basically. And I don't know. I like the fact that they've tried to do a bit more with Uhura in this show. On the other hand, I'm not sure that they needed Uhura in this show. I mean, in fact, I'd say they don't need Uhura in the show at all. And there is danger with a prequel if you keep populating your show with legacy characters. You have slightly killed the stakes because there's not many people in that show who anything bad can happen to. Do you know what I mean? Most of them are kind of they're like canon. They've got kind of canon armor around them.
Yes.
I mean, personally, I quite like Ethan Peck's Spock. To me, he feels, I mean, he's a bit more sort of sassy and a bit more sort of modern, I suppose, but like
he's a bit emotional.
I imagine him as a sort of younger version of the Nimoy Spock, although obviously he's supposed to be older than the Nimoy Spock in the cage / the menagerie, so there's a kind of weird business going on there. I mean, similarly, I don't know, the whole Michael Burnham Spock thing, it's silly. It's a silly peg to hang your show on.
Yes.
On the other hand, I don't know, it's the fact is they've done it before. That Spock had a brother we'd never heard about in Star Trek 5. Now, okay, that wasn't a great film anyway, so maybe we kind of forget about that. But at the same time, he even when his parents came on board in the original series, he didn't tell anyone who they were. It's like if anyone's going to have secret family members that they've never mentioned, I suppose he's the guy to do it. I guess the question is like, So you can justify these things. You can find an explanation for these things. You can kind of do your own headcanon. You can kind of work it out. But I guess also the question, just because something is possible, or just because something can be reconciled with canon, doesn't mean that it doesn't also create a kind of ripple or a kind of area of discomfort. You know, to go like super highbrow, Aristotle in the Poetics has this idea of the difference between possibility and plausibility in drama, and that something can be possible but feel implausible, or it can be plausible, and that it's much more important to focus on plausibility than possibility. And I think sometimes if the tendency is to kind of try to work out ways to reconcile these apparent contradictions, and you know, you can do it, but at the same time there's that kind of niggling feeling of, you know, this is kind of weird that we, you know, no one ever mentioned this, or this never came up before. And it creates, I don't know, for me it creates a slight barrier, it creates a slight discomfort. But you know, the flip side of that is you get the fan service, you scratch the fans' backs, loads of people love it. I don't know, you know, it's not for everyone, but some people, it makes them very happy. So
this is true. But then if we go back and think about Deep Space Nine and Next Generation, and how little they fan serviced, but how great and memorable those shows have become over time. Is Discovery, Picard, Strange New Worlds, are they being given a disservice because they are so reliant on the past that we're not really boldly going anymore? We're kind of boldly staying in the same pool that we've always been in. And you know, does that help create iconic, long-lasting stuff? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a valid question. I mean, I would say the first season of Picard, or maybe let's say the first 3 episodes of Picard, basically the kind of extended pilot of Picard, I think did something quite bold and surprising and new, and I loved that story, and I loved quite a lot of the first season of Picard, although I think it kind of fell apart at various points. But that was doing something different. Now, all this talk about the 3rd season of Picard. Now, I'm really excited for the 3rd season of Picard. I had massive issues with the 2nd season of Picard, but the 3rd season of Picard sounds like fun. At the same time, they're saying this is going to be season 8 of Next Gen. I would watch season 8 of the Next Gen. That's great. You know, like I'm totally down for that. The Next Gen fan in me is like, wow, I want to see that. At the same time, that's what the new Star Trek is an extra season. And, you know, we had that with the X-Files, you know, an extra season of a show that finished, you know, whatever, 20 years ago or something. I don't know. It's not, and you're right. I think like, I think all the new Trek shows are in some ways shackled to a certain extent. You know, even something brilliant like Lower Decks is so that's doing it in a parody way, and I think that gives it more freedom. But you know, something like Prodigy, which I also really enjoyed, and I think it's a great show for kids, but it's very much leaning in on, you know, you've got Janeway there, and you've got all this kind of legacy stuff. You know, I think you're right. There's nothing that is as bold, certainly, as when they did Deep Space Nine, and they were like, okay, we're going to do a show. There isn't a ship. It's just on the space station. Okay, fine. You know, later on they get a ship as well, and blah. But you know, I'm not sure that any of their new ideas are as bold as some of the ideas they were coming up with in the 90s, or even in the, you know, late 80s, weirdly. And I think that is a bit of an issue. It may be something that they get over, because I feel like there has been a slight shift, and they do seem to keep wanting to do more Trek shows. But at the same time, you know, even the things we've got potentially coming down the pipeline, we've got a Section 31 show. I'm not sure we really need that. We've got a Starfleet Academy show. Well, that might be fun, but at the same time, okay, it may or may not be a prequel, but it's like, okay, now we're going to see the cadets, and it's kind of again, it's sort of like pulling back and not going forward. Do you know what I mean? Somehow it's this sort of sense of like, I think it's true that, you know, there was something about Star Trek and about particularly like Next Gen, DS9 Voyager, that kind of era. They were pushing forward. They were kind of, you know, the technology had advanced. Everything had kind of, they gave a sense there had been this time jump. Things had changed. The geopolitics had changed. The Klingons are friends now. All this kind of stuff. I don't know. I think there's a kind of hesitancy, or certainly there has been for a long time, hesitancy to think through, okay, what does the Star Trek universe look like after Voyager went off the air, or really after DS9 went off the air, because Voyager didn't show us any of it because they were in the Delta Quadrant.
Sure.
And the Trek novelists have spent decades working all of that out, filling all of that in, thinking quite deeply about some of those things. What's the kind of aftermath of the Dominion War? What's the kind of they've engaged with all these questions, whether you like their answers or not. And I think for a long time the kind of official Trek output was just refusing to go there. Now they're sort of dipping their toes in the water, but something like season 2 of Picard, you get one episode that appears to do that, and everyone loved it, and it's like, wow, this is like early 25th century Star Trek. This is the continuation of that story that we watched for all those years. And then we're snapped away from it and we spend the whole season somewhere else, and we're like, what about that amazing show that you just showed us for an hour? When do we get that back?
No, that opening of Picard season 2, like there was something bubbling inside me. I was like, oh my gosh, these are real Starfleet ships, and I was kind of in it until then they snap us back, and then we go into just absolute lunacy for the rest of season 2 of Picard. I have nothing good to say about Picard season 2. It was mind-boggling how juvenile the whole thing was, and kind of canon shattering in certain instances. Why does Guinan not know who he is? Like,
again, I had an explanation for that, which sort of just about makes sense, but it feels wrong. Do you know what I mean? Like it's like they can say, okay, the way time travelers worked and the way that this timeline has affected this thing, this is why she doesn't remember him. At the same time, it's just your kind of instinct is no, she should remember him.
She should, because
no, she knows him. That's the kind of point of their relationship. Is that they meet at different times. It's that kind of time traveler's wife, Doctor Who type.
Similar to
they're kind of thrown that out the window, really.
Yeah, like similar to the Borg Queen. It's like, well, if she has been the Borg Queen this whole time, this just completely underwrites him being abducted by the Borg, and it underwrites every Borg story that happens afterwards. Because if she's been there and she's been this good Borg this whole time, Agnes,
where was she?
Where was she? Just hiding out, like in, I don't know, some too far away quadrant. Like, why was she not getting involved in saving all these people's lives? Yeah, it's just it's stuff like that I think, when you're watching it and you've seen all of these other series, TNG through Voyager and Enterprise to some degree, honors so much of the history of the show, and then these things just sort of coming in and just playing fast and loose with it. I think that's why people get so frustrated. And I think, again, that's why I look at New Trek and I'm like, this is kind of more of a parody. And I think Frank earlier in the chat said he loved Into Darkness because it had Tribbles and Khan. Well, everyone knows Tribbles and Khan. Were you going to say, Phil?
I was going to say the same thing. When I saw Into Darkness, I didn't know much about Star Trek, but I knew Tribbles and Khan. And I felt the same kind of way. I was like, it's Khan, yeah. Oh, there's Tribbles. Oh, yeah, I know those, And then that's kind of how I was. That was my first impression of Into Darkness, which is a little bit shameful now in retrospect, but that's how it is, They got me. They got me in that moment in 2013.
There's actually, although I said Into Darkness is just pants. I mean, the one time I watched it and quite enjoyed it, I watched it, and for some reason, I had to watch it for research for something, and I watched the first half, and then something happened, and I had to switch it off. And actually, the first half of that movie is not bad. It's just that it falls apart so catastrophically in the second half that it kind of obliterates all the good that it's done in the first half. But I mean. Yeah, it's Khan. Is it Khan? I mean, what is Khan? Is Khan just someone saying, hi, I'm Khan? Do you know what I mean? It's like, what does it mean? And what's the point of someone else being Khan? I don't know. Like, I don't get it. It's not Lex Luthor. It's not like, do you know what I mean? They're then, I don't think Star Trek kind of has iconic villains, but they're only iconic because there's like a good writing, great acting, I don't know. They're not iconic in this kind of comic booky way.
Correct.
I don't think someone else turning up and saying, "Hey, guess what? I'm Khan." Especially when it's Benedict Cumberbatch, who blatantly isn't Khan. It's just like, I don't know. He was a good villain, but it made no difference that he was Khan.
No, you could have changed his name.
No sense. It was like, just have him be someone else. And great, get Benedict Cumberbatch to be the villain. He's brilliant. But that choice, it was stupid. Playing out the whole, Spock dying in the Wrath of Khan. Now it's Kirk, and we're doing this kind of switcheroo. That is Star Trek being literally a parody.
Yes.
But they thought it was, and this was kind of an issue with Nemesis as well. I think. I mean, one of many reasons that Nemesis didn't work is they're leaning so heavily into this kind of like, okay, Wrath of Khan is the best Star Trek movie ever. Wrath of Khan is like one of the best sci-fi movies ever. Somehow, someone made a Star Trek film that is so iconic, so brilliant, so dramatic, such an incredible piece of cinema. The answer to that is that we just have to try and copy the beats of that film. And somehow our film is going to be equally good. It's idiotic. That kind of mindset, and what you end up with is parody. But it's parody that's kind of trying to take itself seriously. So sorry, I meant to be on the other side of this thing, but there are definitely moments Star Trek has drifted into self-parody. And those few of them.
Yeah, I mean, this thing is it's one of those things where this isn't, I'm not sitting here wanting to just shoot all the arrows at new Trek. I mean, there's plenty of stuff in old Trek that does, that doesn't work and does wobble. Enterprise for me was a series that I just didn't connect with at all. It was one of those things I could have watched that from the beginning live. I was at an age where I was like, yeah, this could be my new Star Trek, but I tried it. That theme song, we've all made fun of the theme song. What the heck was that about?
I gotta see that. I gotta hear that one.
It was, Archer. I didn't really like Scott Bakula. I didn't connect with him. Didn't really connect with anyone in the show. It just felt, don't know. I didn't dig it. But there are certain episodes that I've gone through and watched. I'm like, actually, this is a good episode, or this is a good two-parter. But still, on the whole, when you have episodes of everyone rubbing each other down with blue sparkly stuff in the decompression chamber, you're like, what the heck am I watching here? Like, what is this? This is
where did we go?
Kinda, yeah.
There are a lot of bad decisions, famously. But I mean, I think part of it, you can blame some of it on the kind of network interference and so on.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason DS9 is such a great show is basically everyone washed their hands of it quite early on and was like, yeah, we don't know what they're doing. Just let them get on with it. Basically hands off. The network on Enterprise apparently wanted to have a section in the show every week where they had a different band, like a contemporary band performing on the ship, and they would be like holograms from the early 2000s or whatever. And they managed to talk them out of that one. But I suppose that gives you a little bit of an insight into the kind of conversations that were maybe going on about because Star Trek was a big deal for Paramount at the time. It was a flagship show for them, and they wanted it to fit with their network and their kind of ethos and so on. And Voyager in some ways suffered from this as well. But I mean, the other thing with Enterprise is I do think there was I don't think Enterprise is a great show. It's sort of down towards the bottom of my rank of Star Trek shows. There are episodes of it I love. There are characters that I like. There are performances that I think are great. But it's I don't think it does. It's way short of its potential. I mean, people say Voyager's short of its potential, and I think that arguably is true as well. A lot of people say with Voyager, when Battlestar Galactica came out, they were like, that's the show that Voyager should have been. That is done with Voyager. This ship stranded in the middle of nowhere, getting the ship beaten out of it. This kind of, and then they did it for 2 episodes with Year of Hell. They basically did that kind of thing, and then they reset it, and it all kind of went back to normal. I mean, Enterprise actually, Brannon Braga, who was basically the lead writer on Enterprise, wanted to do this show where they spent the whole first season on Earth, and they didn't launch the ship till the end of the season. And I don't know, it might have worked, it might not. But that at least was a new idea. That was doing something different. they ended up doing this kind of next gen light kind of weird retread where it's kind of a prequel, but it kind of doesn't. In some ways, it feels like a prequel. In other ways, it doesn't, and they're never quite sure what they're going to do. But I sort of think, if Battlestar Galactica is like what Voyager should have been, and Ron Moore, before doing Battlestar Galactica, worked briefly on Voyager for a couple of episodes and quit, having written loads of DS9 and a couple of the films, and quit Voyager because he was like, I can't work in these conditions. The environment of this show, the context of writing the show is just so creatively stultifying. I can't deal with it. So arguably he then went and did Voyager again in Battlestar Galactica and made it a lot better. Arguably then the same thing happens again with For All Mankind, which is basically that original pitch for Enterprise. Because I think For All Mankind is an amazing show. I also think it's basically a Star Trek show, in that is like the whole kind of ethos of it, the whole sort of feel of it. It is like, how do we get from now to Star Trek? This is kind of the direction we'd have to be going down. And it's fantastic and it's brilliant, and it all, it works as it's not a prequel, obviously, but if you see it in some way like it's a historical drama, it's kind of a prequel to a parallel version of now that presumably we're going to get to at some point. I don't know, it's like it's that concept but done a million times better, and I guess that's always the thing with Trek, and it does come down to the writing, and it comes down to getting the right people. And Next Gen was very lucky; they got Michael Piller came in for season 3. Totally shaped that show. It shaped all three of the 90s Trek shows. DS9 got Ira Stephen Bear, who was
great.
Okay, he wasn't maybe there right at the beginning, but he's the guy who kind of defined that show. So all these shows they've had, and maybe Discovery, Michelle Paradise coming in season 3, she has given that show, I think, an identity that it will now carry forward. And it knows what it is. And the identity it ultimately settled on is probably not what I would have chosen or where I'd have gone, but I can I feel like I know what to expect now from that show. Do you know what I mean? I kind of know what it is. I think it knows what it is, and they're doing that, and lots of people love it. Younger people than us, I think, love that show more for various reasons. So maybe that is, you do need these kind of individuals with a real vision, and maybe one of the reasons that Lower Decks works so well is that Mike McMahon seems to know what he's doing with that show. And it was a crazy, of all the pitches, like that was a wacky pitch to do, but that is a show that absolutely knows what it is and what it's doing. It kind of hit the ground running from day one, and it just gets better and better, but that's never going to turn into something else. It's never going to become a different kind of Star Trek show. It absolutely is what it is, and it knows it. And I think in some ways the original series knew what it was. I mean, as much as it some extent over time, it came out pretty well formed. I mean, the 3 series of the original series, if anything, it's a case of kind of diminishing returns. The first season is by far the strongest, and there's good stuff in all the seasons, but it gets weaker as it goes on. But that is a show that came out of the gate absolutely groundbreaking, world-changing TV, basically. But that is hard. It's hard to do. I guess it's hard to get that straight away. You sort of think it would be easier these days when doing shorter seasons. Potentially you can have more of a. You can know where the story ends before you start filming the beginning of it. At least you'd hope. But then, in fact, it seems even now that isn't always the case. And I think like the first season of Picard, that was kind of even with Discovery, they were saying, this is like a novel. It's all, it's like chapters in a novel. We kind of know where the story is going. The serialization is going to be very different to something like DS9, which was serialized but slightly made up on the hoof to some extent. But even with these shows, it seems like they actually haven't always worked out all the kind of kinks that are coming down the line. They're kind of winging it, which I do find surprising. I mean, you would think, and I don't know how that differs. I sort of assume some of these other shows, I mentioned Better Call Saul, something like that. I don't know how the writers' room works on that show, but like it certainly feels like everything, by the time you get to the end, it feels like everything has led to that point, and it's been quite carefully plotted out. You might not have seen where it was going, but it kind of retrospectively, it all fits jigsaw fits together. I'm not sure that's always the case, even with these new Trek shows. And I don't think they have the excuse that in the old days, they would churn stuff out and they had to, they were desperate for ideas. They had famously the open script policy, which is where you got a load of these amazing writers from, was people just submitting scripts, from their bedroom or whatever, and then being hired. But that's because they had to keep making the sausage. They had to keep putting this stuff out week after week, and it was a real, production line.
Yeah,
it wouldn't really be the case these days. They ought to be able to do things a bit differently, I think.
You would think, and if you think about season 2 of Discovery, I mean, that is a perfect example of a writer's room gone wrong, because that season makes no sense. The plot of the red signals, Michael Burnham is behind it all. So is her mom. Like, none of it really added up in the end. Why was the Red Angel at that church? Why did she bring the people from the future into, onto this planet? And they have a little civilized church. That was a nice episode because it felt like a TOS sort of style episode where they land on a planet. There's an Earth-like civilization. Like, that was fun. But ultimately, in the big picture, it didn't make any sense. And I think that also adds to the frustration, especially with Discovery, with Picard season 2, is it's like, you want us to invest in this serialization stuff, these serialized stories, this long form television, but you are dropping the ball on a weekly basis because your overall story doesn't really add up. And I think one of the biggest problems with this stuff is everything has to be J.J. Abrams mystery box malarkey. And I think that does so much more harm than good, because yes, there are many Star Trek episodes where they are mysteries. There are tons of Deep Space Nine episodes where they are just hard-boiled mysteries, and they're great, but they're really well thought out. And the it's not just a mystery box in which you don't find the answer. It's not just, here we're going to set up a mystery, throw a bunch of flashy lights at you, shooty stuff, and then we'll have some sort of end that, if you're not paying attention, adds up, which I think is the problem with Into Darkness, for example. By the end of that film, you're like, what is going on here? This doesn't really make sense. But the film goes at 90 miles an hour the entire time, so you really can't take it all in. You have to do it on repeat viewing and mapping out, what say again.
Yeah. Repeat viewings were never very strong with Into Darkness. I think I've watched it once again before, like one more time again. And I was like, I don't think I'm going to watch this again. Yeah.
No, but they should. I mean, these stories should be able to hold up to repeat viewing. And I think it's true,
Yeah.
Like the 90s Trek.
Yeah.
Okay, we watched them all on VHS. Then, I had the DVDs. Then, we've watched them all multiple times. And they do, that whole serialized story in DS9.
Yes.
There are a few inconsistencies. There are a few things that you have to kind of slightly ignore or work around, but they're very minor, and the rest of it holds up brilliantly. And it makes even though it's developed on the fly, and sometimes responding, like the whole Worf thing, that kind of threw a massive spanner in the works of the story they were doing, but they kind of rolled with it, and they came up with a whole other story to tell in the meantime, and they kind of made the most of that. I think you're right. Yeah, the mystery box thing is a big problem, and I guess that does all go back to Abrams and Kurtzman as well, and Lost. I mean, it's basically, Lost was the show that kind of pioneered that. And the problem is, it's one thing to have a mystery box where you know what's in the box and you're doing it, but I think the danger is this idea that you can write a story where you as the writer actually have no idea what's going on.
Yes.
And you're just, you're invested in the kind of the tension of the audience not knowing, but it is kind of essentially a sham, because you haven't worked it out yourself. Now, you write crime novels, right? I mean, I don't know, maybe you can make that stuff up as you go along. I kind of imagine you have to have worked it out. Otherwise you end up in a total mess. And at least with a book, if you made a mess of it, you can go back to the beginning and rewrite it. But if you've already started shooting those episodes, you're kind of committed to it. I don't know. So I had a problem with that second season of Discovery. On the other hand, I would say I've seen it twice. So I watched it the first time week by week, and then I binged it and watched it all straight through. It did work a lot better binging it. There were still issues with it, but I think a bit like you were saying, you know, a film that goes 90 miles an hour, it sort of all passes you by and you're swept up in it.
Yeah.
Sometimes having that week in between episodes to analyze, to think about what's going on, to ask all these questions does not help that kind of storytelling, because actually often, you know, the audience is doing work that the writers should have been doing in some ways. And the audience are coming up with better ideas than the writers came up with week on week from the same, you know, the same kind of clues and so on. Or the audience is just much smarter than the writers think. I mean, first season of Discovery, the two big reveals, I don't think it crossed their mind the audience would work those out. And yet they did. Maybe Lorca they would work out, but the whole Ash Tyler thing, I think they thought was going to be like the most amazing twist that no one could see.
It was senseless.
People had worked it out, you know, within a few episodes, because fans know what know what they're about, and they're quite obsessive, and they spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff. And actually, I think that one of the weird elements of the first season of Discovery is both those characters, Lorca and Ash Tyler, they almost had this problem. The actors were very good. They wrote them really well on a like page by page, scene by scene level. You know, both of them as these kind of traumatized war veteran, quite interesting characters for Star Trek. They seem to be doing interesting new stuff. But then at a certain point, you realize actually they're kind of pawns in this plot that's sort of been worked out. And in that case, I suppose it has been worked out, you know, up to a certain point in the season anyway. And they become just you know, chess pieces to move around, and all of that work turns out to be for nothing. And people were quite I think felt a bit cheated, because they were like, I've invested in this PTSD storyline and now you're telling me that never happened, or you know, I've invested in this storyline, now you're telling me none of that is real, and that this person was lying the whole time. And I think, you know, they almost had these two impulses. And I do think with a lot of the modern Trek shows, a lot of people say, oh, it's lazy writing, it's crap writing, these people don't know how to write TV. I don't think that's true. I think, say, something like Discovery, actually, often the writing is really good on a kind of individual level, and the writers, I think, are talented. But it is these kind of meetings in the writers' room, the kind of these big break sessions or whatever it is, you know, where the bigger picture is developed, where for some reason weird, you know, you were saying there's no stupid questions. It's like that, you know, the stupid ideas end up sticking to the wall somehow. And then the often quite talented people are forced to carry those through, rather than someone at an earlier stage saying, yeah, we're not doing that. You know, we need to make this really watertight. We need to make this make, you know, total sense. We need to make, you know, get the structure right, get it perfect, and then start on all this other stuff.
Yes.
And I think it's true. I feel like we've become very negative and like the grumpy old guys.
No, that's fine.
There's lots of things that are fantastic about the new Trek shows. The production values are amazing.
Oh, I love great. I was watching
loads to love, but I think that the plotting is usually where they fall down for me.
The plotting is exactly that is the main. The plotting and I think the characterization are the and the dialogue are the three main things that which are like the pinnacles.
That's quite a lot.
Storytelling.
I don't mind the dialogue on the whole.
The dialogue drives me nuts, because it just you know, you go back and you watch TOS Next Gen and you listen to the dialogue and it works. I listen to the dialogue now and you have characters be like, that's so cool, or that sucks, and I'm like, why are you using modern vernacular? Like, stop it. Like, it pulls me out of the scene, because I'm like, you're speaking how I speak or how we speak today, and that's not what any Star Trek has really ever done. You know, you don't listen to TOS and they're not like far out, or Next Gen being like, groovy. I don't know, whatever a 80s 90s slang word would be. You know, you don't get that in those shows, because it's not meant to be our time. Our frame of mind.
And they're also in the fleet, you know? They got to be a little more disciplined.
That is a really good point, Philip. And that is another thing that bugs me.
Sometimes raise points that are pretty good. Rarely. Rare occasions.
is I do feel that the military aspect is almost non-existent in all of New Trek now. But yeah, when I look at Discovery, it's sort of there. Strange New Worlds, that it doesn't feel like it's a, like there are ranks, like there is a hierarchy, like there is any sort of, everyone just sort of feels like a free for all, and you can kind of say whatever you want to whoever you want and act however you want. And I think that is one particular aspect of both of those shows that irk me. Picard is able to avoid that by not being on a starship, not to live in that kind of space. But Chief Brody Rules in the chat asks, is the problem long form storytelling with Trek? Does it need to stay episodic to stay to the heart of Trek? Every episode a new adventure. What do you guys think?
I'm thinking about it. That's what I'm doing.
Okay, Duncan, what do you think first?
I think, I mean, it's a tricky one because obviously, we both said DS9 is our favorite show. DS9 did these massive arcs. I mean, for me, the best piece of storytelling probably in all of Star Trek is those 6 episodes at the start of the 6th season of DS9, plus the one from the finale of season 5. Yeah. Which was totally groundbreaking at the time to tell a story. And then they did this 10-part finale effectively, or 10-part kind of run up to the finale, and they managed to make those work really well. And that was serialized storytelling. It was very bold. It was very much Star Trek. They managed to make it work. I think that Star Trek doesn't always sit well with serialized storytelling. I mean, I quite like the 3rd season of Enterprise. A lot of people don't. But like that is very much serialized storytelling made up on the spot, where they're constantly trying to elongate the story. A bit like you get with 24. Sometimes there's like these kind of desperate attempts to like string things out because you can see they're heading towards the conclusion too quickly. I'm like, oh my God, we've got to going to have some kind of wacky digression basically to take us down some blind alley. I don't know. I think Star Trek does maybe need something of the episodic, and you can have a mixture. You can have you can do like what the X-Files did, where they had some episodes that are like mythology episodes and some episodes on standalone. I think you can do that's basically what DS9 did as well. Or you can tell a kind of ongoing story, but you have quite discrete chapters in it, and they can feel quite different. And I think Star Trek can do that, and that can work as well. I think Discovery maybe didn't do enough of that, or hasn't so far. And I would say for me, the Discovery episodes that stand out are the ones that are slightly outliers. I mean, everyone loved that one, New Eden, the one with the church. That was a bit of an outlier in some ways.
It was.
I mean, actually, the 2nd season of Discovery, the early part of it, they did do that a little bit more in that they had this serialized thing. They did that episode. They did the Klingon episode. They did, they did have these episodes week by week. It was feeling. The danger was it felt like a different show. Like the whole tone of the show, the whole kind of style of the show shifted from week to week. And that was a bit jarring. And Trek obviously has always done that. To some extent, you've had the holodeck romps, you've had the, intense, two-hander, dramas, you've had the kind of action adventure. It is flexible, it can do that. But I suppose, I don't know what the answer to this question is. I guess it's a kind of balance. It's about having a mixture. Yeah. I think it doesn't always work to just have a serialized story running through with nothing to break it up, because then you do sort of wonder, why is this 10 episodes? Why is this 13 episodes? Why is this whatever? Why is this movie? Why do you know what I mean? Like what are we telling this story in this format? And that often is not clear. And I think that's an issue for a lot of streaming shows these days, to be honest, is that you find, I mean, like, say the Marvel Netflix shows, like Daredevil, Jessica Jones, all those shows. A lot of those, although, I really enjoyed a lot of those, I thought they were great, but a lot of those shows in that era felt like there was an ideal number of episodes to tell the story, and then there was a number of episodes that had been commissioned for whatever reason. Not ever line up. Do you know what I mean? So you can't really make the argument that this is better for the story when it transparently isn't better for the story. Do you know what I mean? If it's better for the story, it's better for the story. Then do what the story dictates. Have an 8-episode season, have a 15-episode season, follow the story. Don't pretend you're doing this to follow the story when actually you're very obviously, just as 24 had to string out 24 episodes every season for a story that maybe was only like 15 episodes. Don't don't pretend that your main impulse is this kind of creative freedom, when, as ever, it's producing the sausage, selling the sausage. I mean, the fact is, Star Trek is a massive, multi-million-dollar industry. It makes an enormous amount of money. We love it as fans. We find it creatively fulfilling and satisfying to watch, and so on. People love it for all sorts of different ways, but it is also a product, and it has to be made in a way that will make as much money as possible, and that's always the trade-off.
The trade-off is the thing. I was gonna say, I think that compromise is the best thing to say about shows like this, and also when it comes to the streaming method that you've talked about, and how it really depends on what story you're telling. And I think I've talked about this on a podcast before, where I was just like, it really depends on what's the purpose? What is your goal? What do you want to tell with the material that you have, and and in that case, what format is it best suited for too? And I feel like that's kind of what the Marvel shows kind of tend to get wrong, because like if they have 10 episodes and each of them is an hour long, and you're telling a story that frankly, many times the shows that I've watched, you could fit into a feature film, and that's it, 2 hours, and you're done. And I think that it would have been fine. So I really do think that for Star Trek, in Star Trek's case, I've always enjoyed, in my experience last week, just binging TNG and happily watching a new episode and seeing where this story was going to go, what it's going to focus on. I always loved 125, or in this case 48-minute episode that has beginning, middle, and end, and then it moves on to another story. But then there are episodes that have parts to them, and because their stories are longer, and in some cases they're enhanced because they have that length, because there's certain things that you have to tell in them that give it a better and bigger impact, and just makes it more fulfilling to have a longer length to them. So it just depends on, I think, what's your goal? What do you because like when it came to like, I'm not a Star Trek person, so I'm only gathering what I know, but I think that the whole, at the beginning of at least the old ones, they were like mission of the start of the Enterprise is to go on a 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds, and then you have that, and if that's kind of the goal, then you have a lot of things to, that's the context that the stories are being put into, and that kind of gives you the opportunity of having all these like individual episodes where it doesn't, it can have an arc to it, but like it doesn't necessarily have to have one. And I think that as far as what I've seen with like, okay, am I wrong? Is Discovery kind of the same thing, like where they're discovering things?
Yeah. Oh, I guess.
Because it's called Discovery.
Very serialized, I think, compared to previous. I mean, Strange New Worlds did bring back that episodic element, and people loved it. I mean, I loved it. And some episodes are better than others, but I really enjoyed the fact. And also, I have to say, because I watched that whole season on press screeners, which actually I love. Even aside from the fact you get to see them early, you get nothing in it. Do you know what I mean? Often you don't even know the title because they don't even put it on the episode. So there's no photos, there's no trailer the week before, there's literally absolute zero expectation. I have really enjoyed that, going into new Star Trek and thinking I have no idea what kind of story this is going to be, and being surprised by it. And sometimes I'm horrified by it. And it's like, I think,
well, I mean, like that's the gamble, isn't it?
Wrong, but sometimes you're really pleasantly surprised by it. And I think that kind of,
absolutely,
it is a different landscape. I mean, the fact is, I don't know, the whole concept of spoilers, the whole, development of the internet. I mean, the time when we were watching Star Trek on VHS tapes, the advanced knowledge that you'd have is like reading Star Trek monthly magazine, that there might be reviews of episodes that hadn't aired yet, or, or whatever. But like the level of kind of, the way all this information was filtered, and the fans. Okay, so like there were a few other kids at my school who watched Star Trek who I could talk to about it, but there wasn't a whole community on the internet. There wasn't a whole of Trek Twitter to debate these things.
Oh,
with.
yeah.
You know, fandom was very different. You could go to conventions, you could meet people, etc. But you know, the internet has changed all these things massively in various ways. And I think in terms of Star Trek, in the, you know, over the last 5 years or so, this kind of, you know, Kurtzman Trek, New Trek, whatever we want to call it, era, I do think you see a lot more because there's that direct interaction with fans. The danger of that is, I mean, we talked earlier about these course corrections. I think in the past, those course corrections were made because someone with a kind of artistic vision came in, whether that's Michael Piller, whether that's Ira Stephen Bear, whoever it is, and sort of worked out, this is what I think this show needs to be. This is the direction I'm going to take it in. I know what I'm doing. You know, ideally, like if you're Ira Stephen Bear, you're lucky they let you get on with it. If you're one of the many Voyager head writers, you have people kind of sticking their oar in. But, you know, it's an individual idea. It's an individual vision. I think the danger with a lot of modern Trek is there is this, it's not just about fan service. It's also about like the kind of toxic side of fandom and not aggravating people. And this kind, you get these kind of course corrections that are much more about, okay, everyone thought the first season Discovery was too depressing and too grim, so second season's like it's all fun. And you know, there's this kind of, and same with Picard. You know, people felt the first season of Picard was too dark, so the second season of Picard is kind of more of a romp. I don't know. It's like it's almost, there's a danger that it becomes kind of focus group led. That the response is, and you're kind of trying to lean into, okay, what do the biggest number of people want? But it's true, you know, that's how you get Strange New Worlds. That was a show the fans wanted. I never wanted that show. I thought that was a really lazy idea for a show. But of all the live action new Trek shows, I think it's the one that I've liked the most. So, you know, I don't know, you know, it's like, even when I think it seems like a lazy idea, actually the laziest idea, I think in some ways they did the best job with. In that they really, you know, they did it. They did what they said they were going to do. It wasn't a very bold or creative or original idea, but, you know, they did it.
Satisfying, then, I guess. That would be a good word to use. But I also wanted to say that, like, it's so funny, like, whenever I come to these conclusions, when I want to, you know, make a statement about, you know, what do you need to make something, you know, good, for a lack of a better word. And it always comes down to, because, you know, you were talking about how it became, you know, things can become very focus groupy because, like, you know, with the advent of social media, it's very, you can get, you know, impressions instantly, and then, you know, studios look at that and then they're just like, oh no, we got to make it different now, you know, just like you said, like one season's too grim, it's going to be lighter next time. I mean, that's been there forever in the entertainment industry, I think, you know, even now it's like more, you know, it's more intense and it's instant. But at the same time, good things did happen from just listening to what people wanted at the same time, and that's why it's so boring whenever I come in and be like and say something like, well, I mean, like, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, and, you know, all of these things that you, Duncan, were talking about, and what we were conversing at this point, like, they're both valid ideas and like things to say and do to make a good show good. In this case, I don't know. I'm sick. Okay, I'm probably rambling now.
There's 50 plus years of Star Trek. There's loads of good Star Trek. There's loads of bad Star Trek. I mean, for the 50th anniversary, I did a complete works Trek rewatch, which, you know, I'd never done before. I probably won't ever do again. It's hardcore. At that point, it meant watching 2 episodes every day from like January the 1st to January the 1st that year. Now there are almost another 100 of them or something. It would probably mean watching 3 episodes a day. I mean, when you do that, you notice there's a lot that you don't remember. There's a lot that you know, if you're used to just going back to the same episodes that you like over and over again, that's quite a selective process. It gives you a sort of distorted idea. Also, though, one of the things that I loved about doing that is you find there are kind of gems that you'd completely forgotten about because they don't register for whatever reason. So I don't know. It's a big, like I say, it's a big sandbox. There's a lot of variety there, infinite diversity within Star Trek. And this phase will pass as well. You know, whether you love him or hate him, Alex Kurtzman's not going to be around forever. Someone else will be doing it in another 10, 15, 20. You know, as long as Star Trek keeps going, which hopefully, you know, touch wood, it will. And it will as long as it's profitable, and it still seems to be pretty profitable. It goes through, you know, fallow periods and kind of bountiful periods. But, you know, maybe we'll like the next one more. I don't know. I mean,
that is a really good point. I mean, there was someone recently who said, you know, oh well, should we just end Star Trek, and it was great, and we have this you know plethora of old Trek that's great, and we just stick with just that. But the thing is, we are literally, you know, just in response to that, someone was saying, you know, we're literally just one season away from the next great bit of Star Trek, and that's why I would say no. It is as painful as this is for me to kind of get through Discovery and Strange New Worlds. You know, I do think there's hope, and I think Picard season 3 potentially has the chance to bring Trek back to a sort of former glory, to kind of dust off, you know, the goodness and
the goodness,
you know, and give the fans what they. I think give the fans what they actually want. And the thing is, with the focus group stuff, what's really difficult with that is the people don't really know what they want until they get it. Right?
That's also true, yes.
You know, you can focus group all you want, but at the end of the day, you just have a story created by committee. Therefore, you have no, like as we were saying with TNG and Next Gen DS9 rather, is, you know, when you have the singular creative push and individual behind that show, it comes together so much better than if you are constantly taking inspiration from what are people saying on Twitter, what is happening here. You know, that
be reliant on that, obviously.
Yeah, that's where things get really really messy, and it's something I think is detrimental to the creative life of any show, Star Trek or anything. So I think, I don't know, I definitely would not want to see Star Trek come to an end. I want it to continue. I just want it to continue well. And I think the best way to do that, you know, once we're kind of out of this phase, and I hope what happens is we move into the future. Like I'm ready to go 25th, 26th, 27th century now. Let's see what's going on there. Because the thing is, you can do so much that's free territory. You know, that's where you can start really breaking the mold, and I think that's what made Deep Space Nine so great. It wasn't the comfy, nice, warm Enterprise. It was this dingy, dirty space station that was just rife with all sorts of riffraff, and it was scary. And Jake Sisko didn't have a bed in the first episode. You know, it's not nice, but it challenged the morals. And the ethics of the Federation, and I think that's partly what made it so great. Because at the end of Deep Space Nine, you're like, oh, thank God, it all still like stands up. There are still good people. The Federation is still a good organization, you know. And because I'm all for challenging what it stands for, you know. That I think that's a really fun aspect, a fun angle with storytelling within the Star Trek universe. I mean, how many TNG episodes are all about, you know, what do we do? You know, the conference table conversations are some of the best scenes in Star Trek, not the action, but these conversations about moral dilemmas and well, do we destroy this, you know, whole planet? Do we save this planet? You know, what do we do with these?
I totally agree.
You know, you have this in I think, is it season 1 or 2 where you have the drug addiction episode where you have the one planet who has the other planet addicted to their drugs, and it's like the Enterprise is like, well, we're caught in the middle of this. What do we do? Which is something else I do think that modern Trek in particular, and this is where episodic I think works in its favor, is you can explore far more interesting topics than if you are doing just a long form arc, because that long form storytelling means you really have to stick with what is going on there. You can't branch out and do your drug addiction planet story. You know, you can't do, you know, your Worf goes and finds, you know, thinks his father is actually being kept in this Cardassian prison camp episode and finds these Klingons that have been kind of brainwashed and brings them back into the glories of the Klingon way of life. You don't get that stuff. I don't think, or it's harder to do without feeling like you're derailing the long form story, which I think Deep Space Nine managed that balance well. And I think as you were saying, Duncan, the balance is really what it's all about. One last question from Frank, and we'll start to wrap it up because we've been going for ages, and I could go for another 14 hours. Frank says, maybe Trek shouldn't focus too closely on backstories. Maybe it needs to have just characters reacting to the story and adventure. I don't agree with that fully, because Deep Next Generation is very much characters reacting to the adventures, and every once in a while you get some feedback stuff. You get some history, family history things coming in every once in a while. But I mean, one of my favorite episodes of Next Generation is Family Reunion, when when Picard goes back to the Vineyard and has that confrontation with his brother, and Worf has his parents on the Enterprise, and that to me was one of the best episodes, because it was like, yeah, there is a life for these people outside of the Enterprise. So I don't think I agree with that idea. I think backstory is great, and I think Deep Space Nine did wonderful things with backstory with Kira, with Dax, Odo, Cisco. They all had wonderful backstories that were fun to explore. What do you guys think?
I haven't seen those.
Sorry, you go ahead.
I haven't seen them, so I don't know.
I think, yeah, absolutely. And, one of the reasons that DS9 is so great is that every character has an interesting, compelling backstory, in a sense. They've all come from somewhere. Whereas, Voyager, less so. Enterprise, really less so. I think, yeah, character is a massive part of it. And even Next Gen, actually, there's quite a lot of, for this group of supposedly really nice, kind of perfect, brilliant, like top of the, cream of the crop of Starfleet guys and girls, there's a lot of trauma and a lot of kind of baggage in a way that they're bringing with them. But I don't know, maybe there's a distinction between like character backstory and like Trek backstory, which I suppose is what we've been talking more about, which is like the continuity and the kind of nostalgia and the kind of fan service and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's where it gets, tricky. I mean, I think Michael Burnham, having been brought up on Vulcan as a human whose parents were killed, that's quite an interesting, compelling backstory. Michael Burnham, having been Spock's sister, is not. That's stupid. And not to say they don't make it work. And I quite like the new Spock. I quite liked the new Sarek and Amanda. I thought the casting was good. I thought my favorite episode of Discovery, I told you, is Lethe, which is actually all about the backstory, kind of tying it in. But what I thought they did there, that was more like the kind of Better Call Saul approach to prequels, in that they filled in a gap that you weren't even really conscious of. They psychologically explained a question that had been sort of, I suppose, hanging, but we just kind of hadn't really asked it properly, as to basically what's the deal between Spock and Sarek? Why have they got this such difficult relationship? They give you this kind of insight. In that episode, I remember watching, I literally I gasped watching it, because I was like, oh my god, this makes so much sense. That's good prequel storytelling. That's good writing. It's psychological, it's believable, it's like, oh my god, okay, now we get it. Now we get why these two didn't speak to each other. Now we get why. And it's not like it set out to answer that question, or it didn't ostensibly set out to answer that question. We didn't think that's why we were watching it, to fill in the gaps to get the answers to that question. It's just, there's that kind of flash of truth that kind of hits you, and you're like, oh, okay, yeah. And now this episode I watched, not that I watched 50 years ago, now this 50-year-old episode that I've been watching for decades, actually, it's not about retconning it. It's about kind of just adding that extra piece of information that you think, yeah, that actually fits 100%. That makes perfect sense. And that's hard to do, the kind of prequel storytelling where it feels totally believable and totally plausible to, get back to Aristotle. And that's what I thought was so brilliant about that episode. But that doesn't happen often enough, I would say.
No. And I think the to kind of where it's like you have this moment like maybe it's great, maybe it could fit and it can work, but then you have the additional problem where there's sort of the messiah complex of Discovery, where Burnham is she is Superman, she is Superwoman, she is untouchable, the most important being in the universe, sort of situation.
Starts the
And
war, she ends the war, she saves the world. Yeah, you know. And I think, I mean, and you know, people have said, oh, all the Star Trek captains end up being really important. Well, yeah, that's true. I do think that by not, I mean, I think it was an interesting choice to not make her the captain, but I think by not making her the captain, it makes it harder for her to be absolutely central to every story.
It's also true,
place,
yes.
because it's like you can kind of buy, okay, the captain is going to be central because they're literally the one making all the decisions and kind of at the heart of it. But when it's someone else who's the science officer or the first officer or whatever she is at the time, I think it's trickier. I do think actually in some ways that show, by making her the captain eventually, they make things easier for themselves.
Yeah, it was inevitable that she would have to become the captain for those very reasons. And I remember thinking the same thing. I was like, well, you know, like we're not going to focus on the captain. And I'm like, well, hang on, pause a minute. Star Trek never really focused solely on the captain. It was always ensemble. There were always episodes that focused on a different person every time, or a group thing. You know, it was very rarely was, you know, except for really TOS, which was either, you know, Kirk or Spock were your main focus. Next Gen and onwards, you know, some of my favorite episodes of Deep Space Nine are the Worf episodes and the O'Brien side episodes. You know, like
you know, barely in some of those episodes. He has like a few lines. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
he's like the boss, kind of, you know, in the background.
Yeah, so I would have been absolutely fine. You know, they should have just made her the captain straight away, and it would have solved a lot of problems. Because I just remember thinking, why would I listen to you? Like, you know, it's weird, and it didn't quite connect with her. I think again, when you think about her Vulcan-ness, that was kind of a missed trick, where it's like, okay, she starts off acting like a Vulcan, but then by the end of the series, she's blubbering, and I'm like, well, we've kind of lost that interesting component to her personality. It's almost like they wanted her to shed her Vulcan-ness and just be 100% rage and emotion kind of thing. And I'm like, what? That would have been more interesting, seeing this human acting more Vulcan than, you know, that could have been added to the dynamic and to her character a little bit. And I think that's partly what I don't like about the new Spock. It's not that I dislike the actor. I think all of the actors in these shows are perfectly good actors. It's nothing to do with them. It's how the characterization is being done, and it's Spock being rage-tastic kind of all the time. He's very emotional. It's like, again, they're kind of stripping Spock of that stoic. He is so into his Vulcan-ness and so repressed with the human side, but then he's kissing so-and-so, he's punching so-and-so, he's screaming, he's, you know...
It's kind of how he was in the movies, too, which...
Oh, the movies were dreadful with Spock.
Well, that's because, like, that's kind of what I noticed with Spock as well, when I was watching the episodes of Strange New Worlds, right?
Yeah.
And also, I was just wondering, like, whenever they bring Spock into, like the movies or this, it's just like, aren't Vulcans supposed to be, you know, less emotional? Because he seems like he's the most emotional out of all of them in some ways, because they always have to, you know, go into, you know, the emotional side and try to draw that out of him a lot of the times, and then it kind of loses what's interesting about being a Vulcan. I'm sick, okay?
You're fine. You know what I think?
The thing with Vulcans is it's like you're supposed to believe there's this seething, massive emotional turmoil under the surface, but they are keeping a very good lid on it. I suppose that's the thing. And like,
okay.
Nimoy's
I
rock,
didn't know that.
It's very much got the lid, on it, except for very occasionally when it comes up. I don't know. I think there's also an element of like the show itself. I think the thing about Discovery is, like I said, they have this character who's raised on Vulcan, but Discovery as a show is the most, and I don't, this sounds quite disparaging, maybe it is a bit disparaging, but it is quite a sort of histrionic show. It's a very everyone's very emotional. Everyone, compared to other Trek series. I mean, I think you're right. The military thing feels slightly by the by. It's much more emotionally open and kind of vulnerable, and like the style of acting is much more. There were episodes. I mean, you liked Family, the Next Gen. Everyone likes Family. I don't mean you liked it. People do love those Next Gen episodes. I can think of Family, Chain of Command, Sarek. 3 episodes where Patrick Stewart cries and gets emotional, and they're devastating. But they're devastating because in the other 100 odd episodes, it's hard to imagine him crying or getting emotional because he's very buttoned up and formal, and there is that kind of military thing. And we grew up in that era of Star Trek where it was quite kind of regimented and formal, and there was that kind of element of it. And the actors have complained that they were told to tone it down. I mean, I don't know whether you say these days they're all good actors. I think that's true. I don't think that's always been the case. And I think sometimes in the past they may have been told to tone it down because they were overacting badly, But there is that is an aspect of Star Trek, is that it is slightly kind of, I was going to say maybe aloof is going a little bit far, but that's an element of it, right? And Discovery, that's really not the case. People are very, and that is one aspect of it that feels more modern. But I think that does appeal more to a younger audience. That's my sort of sense, kind of anecdotally, is people like that. They like that Sonequa Martin Green is a very emotive actor, and she puts a lot of work in. She puts herself through the ringer. Michael Burnham goes through a lot of trauma and a lot of stuff, and she does it all, and she kind of lays it on the table. But it's not very. For those of us who grew up, it's almost like we're like the sort of Victorian generation, and we're like, you know what I mean? It's like it's not the sensibility of Star Trek that we're familiar with. So I don't know if it's so much about whether she's a Vulcan or a human or whatever, as that she's the show that she's in is like it is operating in a different kind of emotional landscape somehow, and just as now they're allowed to swear whenever they want to, they're also allowed to break down every other episode and kind of emote on a massive level.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and we'll sort of kind of wrap it up around this. And it's sort of, I think that it is really aping on modern storytelling, modern television storytelling, which has a far more focus on emotional moments, speechifying, stuff like that. A lot of platitudes. I mean, if think about, I don't know what has come to mind, but if you think about the ending to the most recent Wonder Woman film, like she defeated the villain with a speech of platitudes. There was nothing really going on there other than just, I'm going to say vague things. And I do think that is one of the sad things about the current stuff. And I think if they could rein this in, it could actually help a lot, because I don't mind our characters getting emotional.
I don't mind every platitudes either.
No, exactly. I don't mind platitudes occasionally as well, but it's every episode that I think becomes a problem. And because, like I said, we watched the All Who Wander episode, and it was almost there was a speechifying moment probably every 2.5 to 5 minutes, where someone is giving someone some big grand truth about reaching out to love, and love will reach out to you, and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, this isn't what Trek needs to be about. Trek is I guess it boils down to show don't tell. And I think older Trek maybe did better at showing rather than telling. I think Kay in the chat, did the famous Khan scream. By the time Kirk gets to that point where he's ready to scream Khan, like he's been, they've been through a lot already, and then you have this big outburst moment that is, quite an iconic moment, and no one thinks this is out of line or out of character. It's like, no, this actually works for what's going on in the scene.
Or like some question as to whether he's actually doing it for Khan's benefit anyway, and it's a performance in Kirk's part.
Yeah, that is also true. It is, he is also playing a game to mess with him, but it works in the moment. Whether you're thinking, oh, he's really emotional, but then when you realize, oh, maybe he's not, or we get to the end of the film and he is, you know, slumped on the glass opposite Spock, looking utterly defeated, or when he's tearing up at the end, where he's like, I feel young. It's like everyone in the
his
audience.
voice cracks in the funeral scene.
Oh God, yes.
Beautiful, iconic moment where
Yeah.
that kind of. But I suppose that's the thing. He doesn't. He's not bursting into tears. He's like he's trying to get through it and trying to, maintain his composure. But his voice cracks just slightly on that one word.
Yeah.
I suppose that's the balance. And arguably, a lot of people said that the more. I mean, this is a bigger question about like how do you represent emotions and what's the relationship between the characters on the screen and the audience and so on. But one approach is that it's a bit like they say, if you want someone to act drunk, you tell them to try to pretend to be sober. Do you know what I mean? And in some ways, what can be the most emotional is someone who is like trying not to give away their emotions, rather than someone who is totally kind of open and therapized. I mean, as much as he has a counselor sitting next to him on the bridge, is a pretty repressed kind of guy, and it's when breaks down that it's really shocking. First Contact, another example. Picard screaming in First Contact, incredibly powerful. It wouldn't that would not be as powerful if it was someone else doing it. Because we know what that means for him. He's lost it, and this is a guy who never loses it. He's the guy we can rely on. He's totally sort of solid, dependable, intellectual, and he's an emotional mess at that point.
I guess it's like we were saying earlier about why it was earned in the other shows with with bringing back legacy characters. The emotional moments also need to be earned, and I think they can be potentially done a disservice if there are emotional moments. If every beat has an emotional moment in it, then maybe it kind of does a disservice to that. Kay in the chat mentions the four lights. I mean, that's a great moment where Picard loses it. And when you realize at the end of the episode that Cardassian broke him, he did it. He was about to say there were four lights or five lights. Like he was about to do it. But luckily, and that moment when he admits that, and he's just like, guy broke me, that's wonderful stuff. But yeah, no, I think, guys, this has been a really, really fun chat. I'm glad we got to do this, and I think we should do it again when a new season of Star Trek comes out. We can come reconvene and see what's going on
Star
with
Trek.
You should, but
like I said, season 3 of Picard, right? We can come back and see. Did they turn it around? Did they convince you?
I feel hopeful. I've listened to a few people. I listened to a few interviews with I can't remember his name, Terry Matalas. And someone described him as someone who was inside Star Trek, who is very much invested in it, where a lot of the current Trek at the moment feels like it's done by people who are kind of on the outside, who understand phasers on stun, live long and prosper, so I love the trailer. I loved the trailer for season 3 of Picard. I was floored that I enjoyed it. The voiceover, the shots of everyone, I was like, oh wow, the Titan A looks like a good ship. From the front, it looks a little weird, but from the side and the back and stuff, it has a really nice look. But the front is a little odd. But yeah, no, I'm very excited. And again, like we were saying, we didn't actually sing enough praises for Lower Decks. I really do enjoy Lower Decks. It's not a show that I consider canon. It's just a bit of fun on the side. But you do feel that the people involved in Lower Decks, it's comedy Star Trek, and they're poking fun at all this stuff. They enjoy Star Trek, and I love watching Lower Decks. You do as well, right, Duncan?
Yeah, I love it. I can't get enough of Lower Decks. This week's Lower Decks is when they go to DS9, and I've also seen it on screen. It's amazing. For the DS9 fans out there, it's definitely one not to miss, because I think and and Lower Decks to show that obviously relies massively on fan service. I mean, it is servicing us to the extent that like it's giving us stuff that we, have dreamed of. Going back to DS9 after all these years, live action Trek probably never going to do that because it's a bit niche for them and whatever. But at the same time, it's smart, it's clever. Like the jokes are not always the most obvious one. They're not always the kind of lowest common denominator jokes.
Yes.
It's that they pick up on pretty obscure stuff sometimes as well as the kind of more obvious stuff. So it's kind of, I don't know, it's more satisfying. It doesn't, you don't ever feel, I don't think, that you're being sort of pandered to, or that it's you're being talked down to sometimes, which is sometimes how I feel. I think that sensation I had when they brought the Enterprise in at the end of the first season of Discovery, I felt a little bit kind of patronized somehow. Maybe it's a long-term power, which maybe is a ridiculous thing to say, but it's like that's the tension, I think, for those of us who've grown up with Trek and it's been a part of our lives for many decades. To kind of strike is that, to press those buttons without like making a song and dance about it.
I agree. So Kay in the chat has asked how many spacecraft or aliens has Phil drawn during the episode.
Okay, this is disappointing. This is very disappointing. Thank you. I did like 3 different things of what I wanted to draw, and none of them were satisfactory. But this time, I don't know if you're like last podcast, I tried drawing a version of the Enterprise from memory. It turned out so horribly. And so I was just like, I'm gonna try that again. So I just was like, I'm gonna do the Enterprise, the one from TNG.
Enterprise D.
That's the one, right? You can tell that's the one, right? Did I get the right one? Okay, good, good. And then I put the Borg there, the Borg cube, because that was one episode that I watched. It's called Q Who, I think that's the episode.
Yeah.
Sorry. That episode scared me. That was scary. It's a scary episode. I didn't know. I didn't know what the Borg was. I knew from,
they were scary back in the day,
Yeah.
Yeah. That's like
they were pretty scary.
And yeah, that was a good episode.
We got Guinan here as well.
And Guinan's just like, oh no. That's it. It's
funny.
That's it.
It's funny, we've been rewatching Next Generation, and we're on season 7 at the moment. And as you were saying earlier, Duncan, about like little things you find that are like new gems. For some reason, I've always liked Guinan, but this rewatch of it, I am enjoying her on a whole nother level, and I don't really understand why. But yeah, no, I've really been enjoying Guinan's time around.
Like it's weird for me to say, but maybe it's not, but like Guinan is one of my favorite characters.
I mean, she's the better counselor. She's the better counselor on the ship.
Yeah.
No, this is great. Duncan, give one last shout out to where people can find you and things. Your book.
You can find me if you want to find me online. Best place is probably to find me on Twitter at Barrett's Books. If you want to read my book about Star Trek that I wrote with my mom many years ago, it's called Star Trek: The Human Frontier. It is an academic book, although I'm not an academic and I wrote lots of it, so it's not hard to understand. But the downside of that is it's ludicrously overpriced. So if you can get it as an ebook or at a library or whatever, I would go for that rather than forking out. But and if you're interested in hearing me talk more about Star Trek, Primitive Culture is the podcast that I host over on the Trek FM podcast network, and we've got about 120 odd back episodes, so there's a lot to get through if that's something that appeals to you.
Cool.
Awesome.
And there are links to all of this in the description. So there are links to Duncan's books, podcast, and all that stuff. So you can find all of that in the description. And the last bit of reminder is do make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, because it helps us out and helps us grow and do more fun shows like this.
Yes.
Cool. I guess we're going to sign off. This is the USS Enterprise signing off.
Yeah, thank you so much, Duncan. It's been awesome.
It's a pleasure.
Fun.
Goodbye, chat. We will see you next week. Oh, wait, what are we doing next week?
I don't know what we're doing next week, man.
Oh, my gosh. Okay, next week. Sorry, I just got to mention what... next week we have we have another guest with us, Nadine Matheson, who is a crime writer and lawyer here in London. We are going to do a big She-Hulk smash and bash.
Jeez, I have to watch this now.
Nadine has, who is a big comic book fan like all of us. She has not enjoyed one bit of She-Hulk. It is an anomaly of badness, a unique level of badness for Marvel that is mind blowing, and I have found it hilarious to watch. So we thought, hey, if we can get an actual lawyer to come on the show to talk about a lawyer superhero show, why not? So
Who's a comic book fan?
Who is a comic book fan?
Works
out.
Yeah,
that is what we're
Works
doing
out.
next week. She-Hulk smash and bash. It will be a lot of fun. But yeah, okay. Goodbye, chat. We will see you next week.